Today I join with leaders across all parts of society to pledge South Africa's commitment to generation equality. Our deep disdain for injustice and our firm conviction that equality within a generation is possible is founded and based on the belief that we are all born equal. The right of every living person to equal treatment and equal opportunity is irrefutable. This forum is important because of its clear commitment to forge an intergenerational and an intersectoral partnership. When South Africa raised its hand to co-lead the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights, we stated our intention to advocate globally for economic transformation to benefit the women of the world. We have actively sought to introduce actions into the Global Acceleration Plan that dismantle the systems of injustice and the structures that sustain them to build a global economy that is gender responsive and sensitive. We have called on governments to use their procurement policies as a developmental tool to transfer economic power into the hands of women. We stand side by side with many nations across the world who are committed to ratify and implement the ILO Convention 190 and make the world of work free from violence and harassment. Our global commitments include clear actions to promote women's leadership and voice across all action coalitions and to effectively address gender-based violence and femicide. The road ahead will be challenging, but we have the means and the will to achieve equality between women and men in this generation.
To talk a little bit more about this is Ms. Namhla Mniki, who's the Deputy Director General and Senior Specialist in the Presidency on the commitments made at the Generation Equality Forum. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for speaking to us. So we're talking about women, economic and justice rights. Let's unpack it, the kind of commitments that South Africa have zeroed in on, that it feels it's important to highlight its participation at the GEF.
Thank you so much, Siswam, for having me, and a very good evening to everybody that is listening. So world leaders have called this moment the most important global platform since 25 years ago that is looking at gender equality and gender justice. I think it's significant because it is a moment in history where essentially we are expecting a U-turn that indicates that global leaders recognize the importance of women in economies, in society, etc., and that clear commitments are being taken. And so we're looking at a context where all global leaders, civil society, development actors, as well as governments and private sector are coming together and saying, we've got to actually say what it is we're committing to specifically. Now, you're asking me the question, so what did South Africa bring to the table as we were going to this event? One of the things that we kind of started to zoom in on are the two most critical things for us as we are as a country. One is the issue related to gender-based violence, and the other one is the issue related to the economic empowerment of women. Now, you know that as South Africa, we have been implementing a program of 40% preferential procurement for women in this country. You won't believe that we're one of very few countries around the world that is doing this, that basically we're saying it's important that when we're thinking about economic restructuring and recovery from COVID-19, we've got to stop tinkering in the edges, and we've got to think about What are the systems that help us to transfer real economic power to the hands of women? You've heard our president say one of the ways to do that is to build women in industry, identify the sectors where women can participate, ensure that preferential procurement is a tool that can be used by women-owned businesses to actually leverage so that they can access the economy, as it were. And so we brought that commitment to say already in the last 18 months or so, we've been implementing this program. We've had a program of capacity building, training women. We've had a program of thinking about what can we earmark in each of the government departments in relation to procuring from women. And now we've actually begun to engage with the private sector to say, actually, you've also got to prioritize procuring locally, but particularly procuring from women and young people.
I mean,
so that's just an example of one core commitment we've brought in.
So these are very admirable commitments, but one is wondering that if, for instance, we are still in a position where women don't have bodily autonomy, access to sexual health and reproductive rights, we know that is one of the major problems in this country. Why are we talking about such lofty ideas at, creating systems of economic security where we can't even get the basic human rights right?
Let me make an important correction. I think an error that you just made there around, if you look at our conceptualization of gender-based violence, which I believe is what you are talking about, which is a major crisis in this country. One of the reasons why women continue to be exposed to gender-based violence is economic dependence. In fact, stalwarts in fighting for women's rights will tell you that one of the very first levers you've got to look at is economic empowerment, because economic empowerment creates the opportunity for women to make decisions about, do I want to stay with an abuser or do I not want to? Can I take care of my children when I walk out of this relationship? And in fact, that's one of the most critical decision-making that's one of the most critical decision points that women have to make in terms of GBV. So our NSP, the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, has a fifth pillar, which is economic power, because we recognize that even if we were to put in place the Thuthuzela centers, even if we were to fix our justice system, even if we were to do all of these other things we've been talking about, without economic power, women are not going to be able to actually make the decisions they need to make around whether they can have livelihoods outside that space. But I do not want to ignore an important point you are making, which is to say, while we are talking about economic power, let's make sure that the basics are in place. And in fact, one of the commitments we are taking is that we have fast-tracked the implementation of our National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, which was to ensure that we are working both on prevention as well as supporting victims of violence. And this is something that's reflected by the fact that there's a GBV fund that is in place. It's reflected by the fact that there's more Thuthuzela centers that we are actually putting in place, and a number of other victim support mechanisms that are ensuring that we are supporting women in this area.
And I do appreciate your acknowledgement that the two intersect, that we mustn't pretend that the one exists because of the other. So let's talk about other programs that are structured around the 7 themes that we are talking about. So peace and security, it's something that is also interlinked in some of the themes. South Africa, through its defense minister, recently released a report on not only the role of women, but the suffering that women undergo during peace and security operations. This is not also to ignore that South Africa itself is a host of migrants who are fleeing insecure areas. What commitments are we making there?
So South Africa has what we call the South Africa National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And you are very right in connecting that to the work we are doing in the African continent. As you will remember, our president was the chair of the African Union up until the beginning of this year. And I think as part of that work, the idea is to really recognize the potential role that women and young people can play in peace building, in promoting a culture of peace. And so there's a number of those commitments that actually center around training women, but also front-loading them. In other words, bringing them to the fore in peace building, in mediation processes, so that our tendency for peace can benefit the rest of the continent. Let me mention something else that's interesting around the work we're doing with the continent. It's Africa's free trade area, where we actually, you may remember that our president called for a program of action to ensure that women are participating in trade, so that we are not bound by the borders that we have. And so this is another commitment we've brought to the fore, that we're not only going to talk about the idea of promoting women in trade, but we will begin to implement the kinds of programs that would ensure that women, particularly those who are cross-border traders, in other words, women in the informal sector, women who own small businesses, can actually trade with each other across borders.
Thank you so much for your time. In such a pitch, we have run out of it, but